The phone rang at 4 in the morning, and Corporal Daniel Hartley already had his boots on. He had not slept, not because he could not, but because tonight he was not permitted to. The intelligence liaison, a man whose name he had been given once, and would never be told again, had made that clear in the quiet, unhurried way that certain people speak when they are used to being obeyed without explanation. "Stay awake," the man had said. "Do not write anything down. When you arrive at your post, you will already know what to do." Daniel had stood in the corridor of Wellington Barracks for a long moment after the man left, staring at the floor. He had been in the household division for 6 years. He had stood post outside Buckingham Palace in hail, in fog, in temperatures that turned his breath to smoke and left ice on the inside of his chin strap by hour 3. He had once held his position for 4 unbroken hours while a tourist child screamed directly into his face from a distance of 8 inches, and a second child climbed onto the barrier and had to be removed by a third adult who was apologizing to the sentry box as if it could hear them. He was not a man who surprised easily, but his hands, at this particular moment, were not entirely steady. He laced his second boot slowly and deliberately. The lace on the left boot had a small knot in it, from a repair 2 weeks ago. He had meant to replace the lace. He had not gotten around to it. He pressed his thumb against the knot now and held it there, not because it helped anything, but because it was something physical to focus on. His mind needed something physical to hold on to, some small, ordinary thing that was entirely what it appeared to be, with no second meaning and no weight attached to it. The knot was a knot. The boot was a boot. Outside this room, other things were other things, and they were waiting. The barracks around him were not fully quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a pipe creaked in the way that the pipes in Wellington Barracks had always creaked, a sound with a particular rhythm that new soldiers found alarming, and experienced ones ceased to hear after about the second week. The heating system in this building was old enough that it had genuine moods, and tonight its mood was restless. A door opened and closed somewhere on the floor above. Footsteps moved along an upper corridor, steady and purposeful. A tap ran briefly and stopped. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, the kind of sounds that meant nothing unless you were the kind of man who had spent 6 years training himself to notice when familiar sounds were slightly wrong. Tonight, they were not wrong, which was, in its own way, unsettling. He wanted something to be off. He wanted the world to arrange itself in a way that confirmed that this night was different from ordinary nights, because every instinct he had was communicating with considerable insistence that it was. But the barracks went about its 4 in the morning business without caring what he felt, and the pipe creaked for reasons of temperature and age that had nothing to do with Colin Beaumont or intelligence liaisons or vehicles on Birdcage Walk, and nothing gave him the external confirmation he was, absurdly, looking for. He stood up, checked his uniform in the narrow mirror above the single sink in his room, and noted that he looked exactly as he was supposed to look. That was the thing about the uniform, and he had thought about this many times over 6 years, often during the long static hours of a watch when the only thing moving was his mind. The uniform was so precise and so total that it became a kind of armor not just against the cold, but against everything else. The red tunic, the white belt, the chin strap sitting exactly where it was supposed to sit. The bearskin, 22 inches of black fur that weighed 1.75 pounds and communicated absolutely nothing of what was happening inside the head beneath it. He had always thought that was probably the point. The men who had designed the uniform had not been stupid. They had wanted the thing inside the uniform to be invisible, and they had found a method that worked. He left his room at 4:17 and walked through the barracks with the particular kind of steadiness that soldiers develop after years of being watched. Not a performance of calm. Actual calm, built by practice, repeated until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. The performance and the thing performed converge, if you do it long enough, into the same object. Some of the younger guardsmen were already moving in the corridor ahead of him, preparing for the shift change. He nodded to one of them, a private named Oliver Clay, who had been in the division for just under a year and still carried that particular look around the eyes that new guardsmen carried until approximately month 14, The look of a man who is absolutely certain he is about to do something incorrectly and is prepared for this with great intensity. Clay nodded back and said nothing. That was correct. That was how it was done. Outside London was doing what London did at 4 in the morning in January, which was to say it was cold and dark and indifferent to everything. The streets near the barracks were empty except for a night bus making its slow and lighted way along the far end of Birdcage Walk, its windows yellow in the dark, the small number of passengers inside it visible as shapes. Daniel watched it for a moment. He watched it because the intelligence liaison, in the 31 words he had spoken the previous evening in a tone of complete unremarkable calm, had used the phrase birdcage walk approach. Not birdcage walk, the approach, as if it were a specific and meaningful term rather than a direction. Daniel had not acknowledged this at the time. He had simply heard it, and filed it, and stood still in the particular way that he had been trained to be still, which was the same on the outside whether or not something significant was happening on the inside. He walked to his post. The path from Wellington Barracks to the sentry box at the garden gate of Buckingham Palace is short, less than 4 minutes at a steady pace. Daniel knew it, the way a man knows the layout of his own bedroom, without thinking, without looking down, without needing to confirm his position at any point, because the position was simply known. He had walked it in rain so heavy it sounded like static on a radio with no signal. He had walked it when the tourist crowds along the railings were 6 deep, and everyone had a phone or a camera pointed at the post, and he was the spectacle, and he walked through it anyway, as if it were an empty corridor. He walked it now in the silence of a January pre-dawn, past the iron railings, past the pale glow of the palace floodlights catching the low mist that had settled along the park during the night, past the memorial, its stone white and enormous in the dark, gravity and solidity in a dark landscape. He reached his post at 4:22 and assumed position. This was not a metaphor. He assumed position in the literal physical sense that the regiment used the phrase heels together, weight distributed with precision, shoulders back, chin level, weapon held to the precise angle specified in regimental standing orders. He became, in the way that only years of repetition can produce, a static thing, a fixture, something the eye slides past, the way it slides past lampposts and red telephone boxes and post boxes and everything else that belongs in the permanent landscape of a city, classifying each object as background, as familiar, as part of the architecture, rather than something requiring active attention. This was exactly what the uniform was for, and tonight, for reasons that were still only partly visible to him, it was also exactly what was required, because Daniel Hartley was not tonight only standing guard, he was watching Birdcage Walk. The road that ran along the south side of St. James's Park was quiet at this hour. A taxi moved along it at 4:28, its yellow light on, moving at the pace of a car that was not going anywhere in particular and was available to go somewhere if asked. A night worker on a bicycle crossed the junction at 4:31, head down against the cold, not looking at anything that wasn't directly in his path. A fox appeared at 4:34 from the direction of the park, materializing out of the dark with the specific abruptness of urban foxes who have long since decided that the city belongs to them during these hours, sat for a moment on the pavement with the undeserved dignity that foxes assume at odd hours, and disappeared again into the park without urgency. Daniel catalogued each of these without turning his head. The eyes moved, the head did not. This was a skill that civilians did not typically associate with ceremonial guards, which was, he had always thought, precisely why it was useful. He was looking for something specific. He had not been told exactly what it looked like. He had been given a shape of information, a vehicle, a pattern, a timing. 3 passes, the liaison had said, is not coincidence, it is a message. Daniel was not looking for the vehicle in the sense of a man searching for something. He was watching in the broader sense, staying receptive to the available data, letting the watch do what a watch was supposed to do. The distinction mattered. A man searching narrows his attention, a man watching keeps it wide. At 4:49, A dark saloon car moved slowly along Birdcage Walk, from the direction of Victoria. It moved at the speed of a car whose driver was either genuinely uncertain of his route or was conducting some business that required a pace below the normal flow of traffic. It was not dramatic. It was not suspicious in any way that a person standing on the pavement would have flagged as suspicious. It was simply a car moving more slowly than the road's empty conditions required. It passed the gate. It did not stop. Daniel filed it, Sokheim, 449. Direction, eastbound from Victoria. Vehicle, dark saloon. Body type consistent with a mid-range executive car. Speed, notably below the speed that an empty road at this hour would naturally produce in a driver with a destination. Windows all closed, occupant detail, none observable at this distance and angle. 1. The temperature continued its patient work. He felt it first in his knees, as always, then in the small of his back, then gradually in his jaw. The bearskin was heavy. It had been heavy since approximately the 45-minute mark of the watch, and would be heavy until the watch ended, and this was simply one of the conditions of the job, like the cold, and the standing, and the stillness, and he managed it the way he managed all of it, by not thinking about it directly, by allowing the discomfort to exist in the periphery while his attention remained where it needed to be. He thought briefly about the intelligence liaison's face. He had memorized it the way he memorized everything useful, quickly, without appearing to try, without letting the effort of memorization show in his expression or his posture. The man was in his late 40s. He wore a gray suit that was expensive in the way of suits that do not advertise their expense, because the wearer does not need to. He had the specific kind of handshake that suggested it had been practiced to communicate a precise thing, firmness without aggression, warmth without familiarity, 2 seconds, and released with a clean break. Everything about him was calibrated, even the 31 words he had spoken. The name, the man had said, as if they were still discussing something they had been discussing before, though they had not been discussing anything, is Colin Beaumont. Daniel had not written it down. He had not repeated it back. He had heard it in the way he had been trained to hear orders, completely, with full retention, with the implicit understanding that the requirement to repeat it back was itself an insult to the act of listening. Colin Beaumont, a name he had never heard before that moment. A name he did not know the context of, the significance of, the origin of, the risk attached to. A name he was carrying the way you carry something you have been told is fragile, with care, without knowing why it matters, trusting that the instruction to be careful was given for a reason. At 5:11, the dark saloon car came back. Same direction, same patient speed. It passed the gate again. The passenger window was open by 1 inch, perhaps slightly more. The cold was not a reason to open a car window at 5 in the morning. Daniel did not move. He did not change the angle of his weapon, or the set of his shoulders, or the direction of his eyes. He continued to observe the road ahead of him while using the peripheral range of his vision to collect what the passing car offered him, which was a window open in cold weather, no visible hand at the opening, no face at the opening, just the darkness of the car interior and the inch or two of cold air admitted by the lowered glass. People did not open car windows in January at 5 in the morning without a reason. He filed it a second past 5:11. Same direction, passenger window open, 1 to 2 inches, no observable occupant detail. 2. Or the car would not come back. And that too would be information, the absence of the third confirmation, the withdrawal of whatever signal was being sent, and he would carry that absence along with the 2 passes to the handover and pass it on, and the people who received it would make of it what they made of it. His job was not the interpretation. His job was the observation and the carrying. At 5:29, with exactly 30 minutes remaining in his watch, the dark saloon car came along, Birdcage Walk for the 3rd time. It moved at a speed that was slightly above the previous 2 passes, not rushing, but with a quality of settled intention, the way something moves after it has done what it needed to do slowly, and is now moving with the certainty of having confirmed what it came to confirm. The passenger window was closed. The rear left window was not. Daniel saw one thing before the car turned and was gone. A face, pale, male, looking not at the palace, not at the memorial, not at the railings or the park or the junction ahead, looking at the sentry box, directly at it, for 1 second, perhaps slightly less. The face oriented itself toward the specific post where Daniel stood, made its confirmation, and was then moving away as the car took the junction. Then the car was gone. Birdcage Walk was empty. A pigeon landed on the pavement 14 feet to his left, regarded him with the complete moral indifference of pigeons, and flew away without ceremony. Daniel Hartley stood at his post, weapon at the correct angle, chin level, heels together, everything in its place. Inside his chest, something was moving very fast. Outside, he was stone. 30 minutes. He had 30 minutes, and at the end of them a man was coming to take his place, and that man would receive what Daniel was carrying, and the chain would continue in the direction. Chains like this always continued, away from the post and toward the people in the rooms who knew what to do with what the post provided. He stood. He watched. He waited. Somewhere across the sleeping city, Colin Beaumont was doing whatever Colin Beaumont did in the hour before London woke. He did not know that 2 soldiers already knew his name. The relief arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, which was not a coincidence, because nothing about the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace happened by coincidence. It was a mechanism, and the mechanism ran with the accuracy of something built from long practice rather than from sophisticated technology, which was its own kind of accuracy, and in some respects more reliable. Corporal Daniel Hartley stood at his post in the pale gray of the January pre-dawn and heard the footsteps before he saw the face. He knew the rhythm of a guardsman's step in full kit, in the particular way you know specific sounds once they have been present in your environment long enough, not by thinking about them, but by their absence being notable. The additional weight in the stride that came from the boots, the tunic, the bearskin, the weapon, the slight adjustment in gait that full ceremonial kit produced in every man who wore it, a small restriction of movement that the body adapted to and then carried even when the kit was removed for months. Private Peter Aldous appeared around the corner of the garden gate, approach at 6:01. He was 24 years old, had come to the regiment from Derby, and had been in the household division for 2 years and 3 months. Daniel knew this, not because they were particularly close, they were colleagues rather than friends, in the way that working closely with someone in conditions that require mutual reliability creates a bond that is specific and professional, and not the same as friendship even when it is real and important. He knew it, because in a regiment where the rotation of posts meant that the same people stood watch together over and over across months and years, you learned your colleagues the way sailors learn the sea, with thoroughness and with the understanding that the quality of your knowledge of them was not separate from your operational safety. Aldous moved into position beside him with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed this handover often enough that the body did it without directing the conscious mind to do it. He was quiet by nature, which was a quality that could mean different things in different people, but in Aldous meant something specific and useful. He heard what was said to him, not in the superficial sense of registering words, in the sense of receiving them completely and storing them accurately and being able to produce them again in the same form they had arrived, without distortion, without the editorializing that most people applied to information without noticing they were doing it. The formal handover protocol required approximately 90 seconds. The words were spoken in the correct sequence, the checks were made, the movements completed. All of it served the function not of ceremony but of absolute clarity. At the end of the 90 seconds, both parties and any observer would know without ambiguity that the handover had occurred and who was now responsible for the post. This kind of structured ritual existed because ambiguity at the handover of a guard post had been a historical problem, and the ritual was the solution to that problem, a solution so effective through repetition that the problem it solved had become invisible. When it was done, it was completely done. And then what happened next was not in any published protocol. "Vehicle," Daniel said. His voice was at the level of a spoken word, at close range in still air, audible at 2 feet and absorbed by the air before it reached anything beyond that. Not a whisper, which had its own physics and carried in ways that were counterintuitive. Just words, spoken with the precision of a man who had measured his voice and knew what it did at different volumes. Peter Aldous said nothing. This was correct. He was listening. Dark saloon, 3 passes, 449, 511, 529, eastbound, each time from the Victoria direction. Second pass had the passenger window open by 1 to 2 inches, cold air, no reason for the window to be open. Third pass, the rear left window was open, male occupant visible in the rear seat. Pale complexion, somewhere between 40 and 50 years of age, no notable features at the distance and light conditions. His gaze went directly to this post on the third pass. Not the palace, not the memorial. This post. Aldous was looking straight ahead, not toward Daniel, not toward the palace, but forward, the same forward he always looked toward on post, but with a quality of attention behind it that was different from the attention he paid to the street. He was placing the information in the particular arrangement that allowed for accurate retrieval, building the internal structure the same way a careful man shelves books, so that finding one does not require disturbing the rest. "The name is Colin Beaumont," Daniel said. A pause of exactly the length required to receive that information and confirm its receipt. "Beaumont," Aldous said, almost inaudible. Not a question, the word of a man checking that what he had placed on the shelf was the thing he meant to place there. Yes. Colin. Yes. The whole of it. Every piece of what Daniel had collected and carried, and held intact across 6 hours of cold and watchfulness, passed in under a minute to the person who was supposed to have it next. There was, in this, a satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of completing a task in the ordinary sense. It was the satisfaction of a mechanism functioning as it was designed to function, which was its own thing, separate from the content of the mechanism's operation. Aldous assumed the post. Daniel stepped back, adjusted to carry position, and walked without looking back. In the guardroom, he removed his bearskin with the learned care of years and set it correctly on its stand. The chin strap came off. The cold that had pressed against his face for the better part of 6 hours lifted, and the absence of it was for a moment so pronounced that it had a specific quality he could not name, something close to physical gratitude. He sat on the bench with his weapon across his knees. Raymond Ford was writing in the duty log at the corner desk. George Hilton was drinking tea. Neither spoke. This was fine. The guardroom at this hour had its own texture, a settling down quality. The room receiving back a man who had been outside and allowing him to return to something approaching ordinary. He thought about the face in the third pass window and made the effort not to interpret it, the same effort he made professionally every time he noticed himself beginning to move from observation to conclusion. You saw what you saw. The face, the direction of the gaze, the timing. These were the facts. Everything beyond the facts was architecture that he was not authorized to build. Ford looked up from the duty log. "Good watch?" "Quiet," Daniel said. Ford nodded and returned to his work. At 6:50, Daniel was called into the small office off the guardroom. The man at the desk was not the intelligence liaison from the previous evening. This was Major Vincent Calder, tall, in service dress rather than ceremonial kit, which meant he had come from somewhere else and not from another post. He had the face of someone who had at some point in his career made a deliberate decision about how much of himself to show in professional settings, and the answer had been, not much. It was not an unfriendly face. It was a managed one. "Corporal Hartley," Calder said. "Sir, sit down and tell me your watch." Daniel sat and told him everything. The same words in the same order, with nothing added. The vehicle, the 3 passes and their times, the open windows, the face, the direction of the gaze, the duration, then the name. Calder listened without expression. When Daniel finished, Calder looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. in the manner of a man confirming something to himself, rather than thinking about what he had just heard. "Beaumont," he said. "Only the surname." "Yes, sir." "You've not been told anything further about him?" "No, sir." Calder stood, which was the close of the conversation. He extended his hand. The handshake was firm. 2 seconds, released cleanly. The same as the liaison the evening before. Daniel noted this without comment. "Get some sleep, Corporal," Calder said. "Sir." Daniel walked back to his room and lay down on his bunk without removing his service dress. Outside the window, London was assembling its morning from the small sounds that preceded the larger ones. A vehicle, a voice somewhere, the distant evidence of the city deciding to be awake again after the brief truce of the deep night hours. Peter Aldous was at the post. He was watching Birdcage walk. Daniel stared at the ceiling and let the silence of the room hold him until sleep, patient and professional and complete, arrived and took him out of the morning entirely. He did not dream, or if he did not remember any of it, which was also the correct outcome. The watch was done. The name had moved. What happened to it next was no longer his to carry, and this was not abandonment but precision, the professional understanding that a chain carried by too many hands simultaneously was not stronger but weaker, that the right thing was to pass and release and return to the still, available attention that the next watch would require. He slept. The bearskin stood on its stand. Outside, Oliver Clay walked past the room on his way to breakfast and looked at the closed door and kept walking, because there was nothing at the closed door that required his attention, and he had learned, in 14 months, to be precise about what required his attention. The building went about its business. And Birdcage Walk stretched empty and pale in the winter morning, watched by a soldier who was carrying a name he could not yet see the full dimensions of, patient and steady at the post where the night's information had first entered the chain that was now carrying it, quietly and without record, toward the people who would know what to do with it. The thing about the intelligence liaison's visit the previous evening, the thing that had stayed with Daniel in the spaces between the more immediate demands of his watch, was not the name he had been given. Names could be removed from their context and become meaningless, and Colin Beaumont, standing alone without the structure of information that surrounded it for the people who had decided the name needed to move, was just a name. The thing that had stayed with Daniel was the manner of the visit itself. The liaison had come to Wellington Barracks at 6:57 in the evening, at a time when the barracks was at its most occupied and most routine, its corridors full of men coming and going from mess and duties and the ordinary administrative processes of military life. He had arrived without ceremony and without any external identification of himself that would have drawn the specific notice of the people he passed. He had found Daniel in a corridor, had walked with him for 12 steps in the direction Daniel was already going, and in those 12 steps had said the 31 words that constituted the entire content of the exchange. Then he had turned at the corridor junction and walked the other way, and was gone, and Daniel had continued in his original direction, carrying the 31 words and everything they implied. This method was not casual improvisation. It had been designed. The approach to a man in motion rather than a man at rest, in a corridor rather than a room, the 12 steps of parallel movement, the 31 words rather than 40 or 20, the calculation of what was required and the execution of exactly that and nothing more. This was the work of someone who had made this kind of approach before and had developed, through experience, the specific form of it that minimized the creation of any observable event. Two men walking the same direction in a barracks corridor were not two men having a meeting. They were two men in a corridor. The corridor was full of men. The event did not exist. Daniel had understood all of this in the moment it happened and had continued to understand it through the hours of the watch, and it had contributed to his sense of the weight of what he was carrying. Not just a name, but a name that had been delivered with such precision that the delivery itself was a communication about the seriousness of the name. You did not design a 12-step corridor approach for something ordinary. You did it for something that could not be found in any record. And that precision, That care, that designed invisibility, was exactly what the face in the third pass window had been looking for, looking to confirm, looking to see with its own eyes that the chain was running, that the delivery had reached the post, that the mechanism was in motion, which meant that the people who had sent the car had known about the corridor visit, had known it would produce a running chain, had known which post the chain would run through, and at what hours. Daniel had filed this and set it aside because it was interpretation, and interpretation was not his job. But it sat in him with the specific quality of something that was waiting to become someone else's problem, and he was aware that he was the carrier of it, and that the carrying was temporary. At 5:44, with 16 minutes remaining in his watch, a delivery van had appeared on Birdcage Walk from the direction of the Palace Mews end of the road and had moved along the road at a speed consistent with a delivery driver checking addresses. It had not matched the description of the saloon in any observable way. Daniel had noted it and filed it, and returned his attention to the junction where the saloon had appeared 3 times and had now, it appeared, finished appearing. The absence of a 4th pass in the remaining 16 minutes of his watch was itself a kind of information. The pattern had been established with 3 passes, and the establishment of the pattern was the signal. A 4th pass would have been repetition, and repetition was noise rather than signal. The people who had sent the car knew the difference. They were, all of this suggested, precise people. This thought had arrived and settled in Daniel at 5:51 in the morning, 8 minutes before the end of his watch, and it had stayed with him through the handover and the walk to the guardroom and the conversation with Calder and the return to his bunk. Precise people, with managed vehicles, who knew the corridor approach and the watch rotations and the informal channel and the specific post where the channel was running on this particular night. He slept with this knowledge inside him, the way soldiers sleep with the knowledge of the next watch already present. Not gone, not set aside, just moved to a different register, held lightly, available when required. The thing about the household division that most people outside of it did not understand was that it had always been 2 things simultaneously, and that these 2 things were not in tension with each other, but were in fact the same thing operating at different levels of visibility. The public thing was the ceremony, the uniforms, the bearskins, the measured march, the perfectly synchronized movements, the sentry boxes with their motionless occupants. This was what the tourists came for, and what the cameras captured, and what appeared in the guides to London, and in the travel sections of newspapers, and in the memory cards of people who had queued in the cold for an hour to see it. It was genuine. It was real. It was not a fiction or a performance in the derogatory sense. It was a practiced and maintained and historically rooted form of order, and it required real skill and real discipline to execute correctly, and the people who executed it had devoted years to acquiring those qualities. The other thing was older and quieter, and had never been given an official name, because giving it an official name would have required acknowledging it officially, and acknowledging it officially would have placed it within a formal structure, and placing it within a formal structure would have changed its nature so fundamentally that it would have ceased to be the thing it was and become something else entirely. What it was, at its most basic, was this: men who stand in the same places at the same hours over long periods of time accumulate a precise and granular knowledge of those places that cannot be produced by any other method. An analyst in an office, reviewing camera footage or traffic data or reported incidents, works from representations of a place. A sentry works from the place itself, experienced in real time, accumulated day after day and night after night, until the pattern of the place is not something known consciously, but something felt, the way a musician feels when a note is wrong, before understanding why it is wrong. This particular quality of knowledge, which the regiment had always possessed in its post holders and had never officially described, produced a specific capacity. The sentry knew what was normal. And knowing what was normal meant that what was not normal was immediately and unmistakably recognizable, even when the deviation from normal was small enough that it would not appear in any formal record or cross any reportable threshold. And the sentries talked to each other, not in reports, not through channels, at the handover, in the brief window of close proximity that the protocol created, and then the protocol formally closed, in the space between the formal end of the handover and the physical separation of the two men, which was sometimes 10 seconds and sometimes 30 and was never more, a word was possible, a description, a time, a direction, a pattern observed. These words were small, and they were precise, and they left absolutely no trace behind them, because they were spoken in the open air, at a volume that carried to no recording device, and to no ear that was not right there. And then they were gone, existing only in the memory of the man who had received them, carried to the next handover, passed again, traveling through the chain the way water travels through a series of connected vessels, without friction, without documentation, without any institutional evidence that it had moved at all. Corporal Daniel Hartley had not known about this layer of the regiment's operation in any explicit sense when he first joined. You could not be told about it directly, because direct telling created a record, and the record was what could not exist. You came to know it by watching the older soldiers, by observing the quality of their attention at the handovers, the specific way they listened at the conclusion of the formal protocol, the slight additional pause before the two parties physically separated. And then one day, 3 months or 6 months or, for some men, longer than a year into the assignment, an older soldier spoke to you in that window, passed you something, and looked at you with the expressionless face that meant, receive this, carry it, pass it on, and say nothing about any of these 3 things, and you received it. His first deliberate encounter with the practice had come during his 2nd year in the regiment, on an October evening that he would not have remembered for any other reason. Sergeant Frank Edelston had arrived for the handover at the palace gate post with the unhurried authority of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and had no need to demonstrate anything to anyone. Edelston was 41 at that time, with a face that had been shaped by the specific combination of outdoor service and the steady internal discipline of a man who had always been more interested in doing things correctly than in receiving recognition for them. The formal handover concluded, Edelston had moved to assume the post in the window between the protocol's end and his physical arrival at the position. Without turning his head, he said, "White Transit, Westminster Bridge Road, 3 times in the past 2 days. 0300 to 0400 each time, slowing at the south end of the bridge approach on each pass." Daniel had said, "Understood. If you see it on the birdcage walk approach, note the time." That was the whole of it. Edelston had assumed position. Daniel had walked back to the barracks, carrying in his memory a vehicle description and an instruction, and the shape of a thing he had not been fully explained and did not need to ask about. He had not seen the white transit that night. Birdcage Walk had offered him nothing matching the description. At the handover the following morning, he had reported this absence in the same way he would have reported a presence, briefly, precisely, in the window, to the man who received it. An absence was information. Knowing that the vehicle had not appeared on this road at this hour was a data point. The chain received it and moved it, and Daniel never learned what it contributed to. 3 weeks later, Frank Edelston had passed him in a corridor, going the other direction, said, "Good eye," without breaking stride, and kept walking. Daniel had stood in the corridor for a moment, processing this, understanding from the brevity and the absence of context that something he had contributed to had been useful to someone, somewhere further along the chain, without any specification of what, or where, or who. He had not asked. He had filed it and continued. In the years since, the understanding of how this worked had accumulated in him the way all genuine knowledge accumulated, not in a moment of revelation, but through the slow addition of instance on instance, each one adding texture to the picture, until the picture had a kind of depth that no single moment of learning could have produced. The practice was genuinely old. Not old in the manner of a tradition that was described as old for the dignity the description conferred. Old in the historical sense. Its origins were in the material conditions of what palace sentries had always done, which was stand in the same places across long periods and accumulate the specific knowledge that standing in a place across long periods produced. Before there was a formal intelligence apparatus in any modern sense, before there were agencies with buildings and budgets and official mandates, there were sentries at gates who noticed things, and, at the change of each watch, said what they had noticed to the person replacing them. Some of those things had mattered, some had not. The ones that had mattered had, on occasion, found their way to the people inside the gates through methods that were not recorded in any formal history of any formal organization because they had not passed through any formal organization. They had passed through men, from one to the next, in the 2 feet of speaking distance that a handover created. This was the thing that Frank Edelston had eventually articulated to Daniel on an evening 3 years into Daniel's service, during a period of specific operational sensitivity that had required a higher than usual frequency of informal communication through the chain. They had been in the mess, and the conversation had been low and unrecorded, and Frank had spoken with the directness of a man who was not in the habit of wasting time on things that did not need to be said. The formal apparatus is essential, Edelston had said. It is accountable. It produces records. It can be reviewed and corrected. It has oversight. All of these things are necessary and they are right. He had paused. It also takes time. It has latency. Information fed into it at one end goes through processes that are right and good, and which sometimes mean that it arrives at the other end after the moment when it was most useful has already passed. And it has a threshold. Below the threshold, nothing is reportable. And the people on the other side of the things we are watching know the threshold, and they operate below it when they can. Daniel had understood this. It was not a criticism of the formal structure. It was a description of its properties. Every structure had properties, and knowing the properties was not the same as finding the structure wanting. The informal channel, Edelston had said, has no threshold. It has no latency beyond the length of a watch. And it has no record, which is both its limitation and its protection. What moves through it cannot be subpoenaed, cannot be leaked, cannot be intercepted at any formal point, because it passes through no formal point. He had looked at Daniel directly. It also cannot be authenticated. It cannot be verified in the ways that formal intelligence products are verified, which is why it is not a replacement for the formal structure. It is a supplement to it, one that the formal structure sometimes knows about and sometimes does not. This last sentence had stayed with Daniel in a particular way. Sometimes knows about and sometimes does not. It was a description of 2 different relationships between the formal and the informal, and he had wondered, in the years since, which of those 2 relationships he had been operating within on most of the occasions he had participated in the practice. Tonight he was fairly certain he knew. The intelligence liaison had walked into Wellington Barracks with a name and had placed it into the informal channel with evident knowledge of how that channel worked and where it would go. This was not a man who had discovered the practice and decided to exploit it. This was a man who was using a tool he understood, a tool that had been available for a very long time to people who operated at the level where such tools were known. Which meant the chain that began with Frank Edelston and the White Transit and continued through dozens of handovers that Daniel had participated in was known to people who made decisions about how information was moved and when. It was known it was, in some functional sense, part of the apparatus. Not officially, not on any document, but in the practical sense that things which are known and used are part of the system that knows and uses them. Daniel lay on his bunk in the pale light of the January morning and held this understanding with the same care that he held the more immediate contents of the night. The face in the third pass window had been looking at his sentry box. This was the part that pressed against the edge of his professional discipline. The instruction to observe without interpreting was the correct instruction, and he believed in it. But there were observations that carried their own weight, that did not require interpretation in order to be significant, because the significance was in the observable fact itself. A face looking directly at a specific sentry box from the window of a vehicle that had made 3 timed passes was not an ambiguous observation. The ambiguity was in the meaning of the observation. in what the looking was for, and what the 3 passes were communicating. Those things required interpretation, and they were not his to interpret. But the observation itself was clear. And it meant that the name he had been given, Beaumont, and the channel through which it was moving, were not unknown to the people whose car had appeared 3 times on Birdcage Walk between 4:49 and 5:29 in the morning. He turned his head toward the window. Gray January sky, flat and even, the specific gray of a winter morning that was not going to offer anything more than this. The pigeons on the ledge were doing what pigeons did, moving with the small mechanical purposefulness of creatures whose entire existence was organized around finding things to eat and places to sit. He thought about Frank Edelston, retired now, living in Kent, in possession of 20 years of things he would never be able to tell anyone except in the way that he had always told them, briefly, precisely, in the window between the formal protocol and the physical separation, to the person who was there to receive them. And he thought about Peter Aldous, standing at the post right now, watching Birdcage Walk, with the same trained stillness, carrying the same name in the clean and undecorated form in which it had been placed into his memory at 6 o'clock that morning. The chain was still moving. It was still moving quietly and without record through the same mechanism it had always moved through, the mechanism that had no official name and no formal existence and that had nevertheless been useful, across a very long time, to people who needed things to move in exactly this way. Daniel closed his eyes. The room was quiet. Outside London had completed its transition from night to morning and was now fully committed to the business of the day, indifferent and enormous, and generating its usual volume of activity, which was the activity of 3 million people going about their lives without any awareness of the specific thing that had happened in the pre-dawn hours on a road along the south side of St. James's Park. He slept, and the practice continued without him, carried by the next man, who had received it cleanly and would pass it on cleanly, which was all the practice had ever asked of any of the men who had been part of it. What Frank Edelston had also told him on that same evening in the mess, 3 years into his service, was something about the quality of trust that the practice required and produced simultaneously. "You do not pass what you have not observed," Edelston had said. "This is the first rule, and it is absolute. You do not pass what you have inferred. You do not pass what you have been told by someone who observed it. You pass what you yourself have seen, at the time and place of your watch, in the form in which you saw it, unelaborated. If you did not see it, you have nothing to pass." Daniel had understood this as an instruction about accuracy, which it was, but he had come to understand later, through the practice of it, that it was also an instruction about trust. The man receiving what you passed had to be able to trust that what you passed was what you had seen, not what you had concluded from what you had seen, not what you thought was important about what you had seen, not the interpretation you had applied to what you had seen, just the thing itself, delivered as cleanly as language allowed. And the man passing had to trust that the receiver would do the same, that the next link would carry what it received without addition, without the natural human tendency to sharpen an anecdote by removing the parts that did not fit the story, that the chain would transmit the information the way a wire transmits a signal, without adding to it and without losing any of it, so that what arrived at the other end was the same as what had been sent. This quality of trust was not assumed. It was demonstrated over time, through the accumulation of passes made correctly and received correctly, so that each person in the chain knew from experience that the link before them had given them something accurate and the link after them would carry it faithfully. The trust was built by the practice, and the practice was sustained by the trust, and the two were not separable in the way that the theory of it might suggest. It was in this way different from formal institutional trust, which was enforced by accountability structures and could exist between people who did not know each other because the structure enforced it. The trust in the informal channel was interpersonal. It existed between specific men who had demonstrated specific things to each other over specific time. You could not join the informal channel by being assigned to it. You joined it by being the kind of person who was eventually spoken to in the window of a handover, because the person doing the speaking had observed, over sufficient time, that you were the kind of person who would receive what was said correctly. This was slow. It was inefficient by any metric that efficiency was measured. It was not scalable. It could not be expanded rapidly or contracted and then expanded again without losing the quality that made it what it was. But it had endured for a very long time, and the thing that had allowed it to endure was exactly this, that it was slow, and that the slowness was the point, and that the trust it was built on was the kind of trust that could not be manufactured quickly, which meant it could not be faked quickly, which meant the channel was, in the specific way that mattered most, secure. Daniel had been in the chain for 4 years before he had passed anything more significant than a vehicle description and a timing. The significance of what moved through the chain was not his to calibrate. He passed what he observed, and he trusted the chain to do with it what the chain did. But he knew, from what Edelston had told him and from what he had come to understand through practice, that the channel carried what the formal channels could not carry. The small, threshold-level observations of careful people in specific places, accumulated over time, available to whoever needed them at the speed of a morning handover. Major Vincent Calder drove from Wellington Barracks to Whitehall at 7:15, in a car that had no markings and produced no impression on anyone who saw it pass. This was by design. Most things that Calder was involved in professionally were by design, which was one of the reasons that operations requiring careful design tended to find their way to him rather than to people who handled the designed part of things less well. The building on Whitehall where he was going was not a significant-looking building in any way that significance was commonly recognized. It was 4 stories, stone-fronted, with windows of a size that communicated nothing particular and a door that was secured beyond what its exterior suggested. The people inside it were not famous and did not attend the events where famous people accumulated. They worked in offices with the institutional furniture of offices that had not been updated since the 1980s, because updating the furniture was not the priority, and had never been the priority. They worked long hours and produced little that was ever publicly attributed to them, and this was precisely the arrangement they preferred. Calder was met in the entrance by Stephen Oates, who was 53 years old, and thin in the way of people who are always somewhere necessary, and eat when the necessity pauses rather than at scheduled intervals. He had reading glasses on his head, in the manner of a man who spent more time reading than not, but whose hands were usually occupied with something else when the reading was required. He shook Calder's hand in the entrance without speaking, and they went upstairs, because the entrance was observed and the 3rd floor was not. The room they used overlooked a courtyard. In the courtyard there was a single tree, leafless in January, with the particular stripped-down dignity of a tree that had been there long enough to have weathered considerable time and expected to weather more. Oates stood near the window and looked at the courtyard, while Calder sat in the chair beside the desk that had nothing on it. Calder told him everything Hartley had told him: the vehicle, the precise timestamps, 4:49, 5:11, 5:29, the passenger window on the 2nd pass, the rear left window on the 3rd, the face in the rear window, male, pale complexion, estimated 40 to 50 years old, no notable distinguishing features at the available distance and in the available light. The direction of the gaze, not the palace, not the memorial, the sentry post, the duration of the gaze, 1 second, perhaps fractionally less, and the name, Beaumont. Oates listened, without interrupting. This was a professional characteristic of his, and one that was less common than it appeared, because most people who dealt in intelligence also dealt in the constant temptation to demonstrate that they had already connected what they were being told to what they already knew, and this demonstration almost always came in the form of interruption. Oates did not interrupt. He waited until Calder had finished, and was completely finished, and then he was quiet for a moment, in a way that was not the quiet of thinking, but of organizing what was already thought. Beaumont, he said. The tone was the tone of someone confirming a reference, rather than receiving one. That's what came through the channel. Calder said. How many links between the source and Hartley? 1. Direct. The source went to the barracks the previous evening. No intermediary. Oates turned from the courtyard. And the vehicle is not in any current registration holdings. As of 6 this morning, nothing. The search ran clean. A clean search on a vehicle used 3 times on Birdcage Walk between 5 and 6 in the morning, Oates said. He did not inflect this as a surprising fact, because it was not a surprising fact. It was a describing fact, which tells us the vehicle was managed before it was used, which tells us the use was planned. Calder said, that was my reading. A planned use of a vehicle with managed registration for 3 timed passes on a road that fronts a palace sentry post between the hours of 4:49 and 5:29 in the morning. Oates moved away from the window and sat at the desk, though he did not open anything or place anything on it. They were not trying to intercept the name. If they wanted to intercept the name, the window in which it was being carried was known to them, and the method would have been different. The passes were a message. A message to whom? Calder said. To us. Oates met Calder's eyes directly. Not to Hartley. Hartley is the post. The message was to whoever received what Hartley observed and reported, which is us. Calder was quiet for a moment, adjusting the geometry of what he had understood until this point. The name was a door, he said. The name was a door, Oates agreed. Passed deliberately into the informal channel, knowing it would move through the informal channel, knowing that movement through the informal channel would activate the process that the informal channel activates, including eventual passage to a room like this one. The vehicle on Birdcage Walk was confirmation that they knew the activation had occurred. 3 passes, a face at a window, a direct look at the post. Confirmation, not interference. They wanted us to know they knew, Calder said. They wanted us to know they knew about the channel. Not just the name. The channel, a specific, informal, undocumented method of moving information through the household division that does not appear in any formal record of how the division operates. Oates leaned back slightly. They have observed it long enough to understand how it functions, and they want us to know that they have. This was the part of the conversation that Calder had not been fully prepared for, even though, sitting now with it in the room, he recognized that it was the shape the evidence had been pointing toward since the moment Hartley had described the face at the sentry box window, looking not at the palace but directly at the post. If they know the channel, Calder said carefully, then the question is not only what Beaumont is. No, Oates said. The question is also who knew the channel well enough to know that it was the right vehicle for the name. Who made the decision to use the informal mechanism rather than a formal one, and whether that decision was made because the formal mechanism was unavailable or because it was being watched. Calder absorbed this. Outside the courtyard window, the leafless tree moved slightly in a wind that was not strong enough to be heard through the glass. You want a trace on Beaumont's movements, Calder said. 72 hours. Peripheral, no formal flag, nothing that creates a record connecting these events. I want to know if there is a vehicle in his regular orbit that matches the saloon description before this goes further. Manageable. I also want the source, Oates said. Whoever went to Wellington Barracks yesterday evening and placed a name into an undocumented information channel. I need to know who authorized that, who made the calculation that the informal channel was the right channel for this name, at this moment. Calder looked at the desk surface, finding that without creating the kind of documentation that defeats the purpose will be difficult. Finding it carefully is difficult, Oates said. Not finding it is worse. He looked at Calder with the expression of a man who has had this category of conversation before and knows where it goes when it is conducted with rigor rather than convenience. Beaumont is careful. The vehicle confirmed it. 3 managed passes, a face at a window for 1 second, and then completely clean. No trace of the registration. He sent someone he trusted with something he was certain would be seen by the post, because he wanted the post to see it, which means he already knew the name was moving, which means he knew before 5:29 this morning, which means the information that the name had entered the channel reached him before the channel had even completed its first link. Calder said, Between the source and Hartley. Between the source and Hartley, Oates confirmed. The leak, if that is the right word for something that may have been deliberate rather than accidental, is at the origin, or the source, and the other side are connected in a way that is not yet visible from where we are standing. The courtyard outside held its stillness. The tree held its stillness. Somewhere in the building below them, the ordinary sounds of an institutional morning moved through the corridors. Calder stood. The chair made the small sound of a practical chair doing its practical work. By when do you need the 72 hours? By this morning, Oates said. We are already past comfortable. And the source. Also this morning, whatever can be established without a paper trail. By this morning, Oates picked up the telephone on the desk. I have 2 more calls to make. Go. Calder went. The door closed behind him with the sound of a door that had been designed to close without drama, which it did. Oates made his 2 calls. They were brief. They used language that was clear between the parties on both ends of each call, and would have been unclear to anyone who had intercepted either one. When they were done, he set the telephone down and looked at the courtyard. In the city outside this building, in the ordinary moving daylit London of buses and pedestrians and deliveries and school runs and the 10,000 small daily functions of a large capital, Colin Beaumont was doing whatever Colin Beaumont did on a January morning. He had, at some point between midnight and the time Calder had walked into this room, received information that his name was in motion through a channel that connected Wellington Barracks to a room in Whitehall via the informal handovers of a household division sentry rotation. And he had responded to this information not with concealment, not with withdrawal, but with 3 passes on birdcage walk and a face at a window, which was itself a message about capability, about reach, about the length and quality of the observation that had been conducted on the informal channel, long enough and carefully enough to allow a response of this precision. Oates found this, professionally, more concerning than anything that could have been found by searching the vehicle registration database. Because capability communicated through precision was more informative than capability communicated through scale. Scale was easy to produce if you had resources. Precision required something else. It required knowing exactly what to watch and exactly how to watch it. It required, in other words, the same quality of patient, sustained attention that a sentry on post developed over years. And this suggested, though he was not yet prepared to frame it as a conclusion, that the observation of the informal channel had been conducted by someone who understood it from the inside. He looked at the leafless tree in the courtyard for a long time without seeing it. Then he stood and went to find what the morning was going to bring. What the morning had produced. By the time Calder had come back to the 3rd floor at 11:45, and they were sitting on opposite sides of the desk, with the accumulated picture laid between them, was a set of answers that generated a more significant set of questions. The partial trace on Beaumont's movements showed him in the city for at least 36 of the preceding 72 hours. He had been at 3 locations that, taken individually, were unremarkable. Taken together, they described the movements of a man who was operating with the care of someone who was aware of the possibility of observation while conducting it in a way that would not trigger the specific kind of formal attention that would produce formal records. He was not running. He was simply being difficult to follow without effort, which was not the same thing as attempting to disappear. The vehicle had not been traced. The managed registration was clean in a way that pointed toward professional management rather than casual omission. The management style was consistent with a small number of methods, and the method visible here was consistent with a small number of operators, and none of those operators was on the domestic list, which was the first significant thing. It's not domestic, Calder said. No, Oates agreed. It is not domestic, which changes the geometry of the channel question. The channel question was this. If the informal practice of the household division had been observed and mapped by a domestic party, the implications were one set of things. If it had been observed and mapped by an external party, the implications were a different and considerably larger set of things. A domestic party observing the channel meant a leak within the formal apparatus that bordered on the channel. It meant a security problem that was bounded. Finding the leak and closing it would, in principle, resolve the exposure. An external party observing the channel meant something that was not bounded in the same way. It meant a sustained intelligence operation against an informal information system that had no formal documentation, which required a level of patience and access that was specific. It required someone who had been inside the regiment, or had sustained access to someone inside the regiment, long enough to observe the channel operating and to map its shape. It required, in other words, more than observation. It required presence. The source, Calder said. The liaison who went to the barracks. Yes, Oates said, if the source is connected to the external party. Then the name was not intelligence, Oates said. It was a key, placed into the lock, to see if the mechanism was still functioning, to confirm that the chain was active and would move. Calder sat with this. Beaumont may not be a person of interest. Beaumont may be a test case. Beaumont may be a name that means something in the right context, and nothing in this one, Oates said. A name with the right weight to warrant passing through the channel, without having any specific operational significance in the immediate term, something that would be passed and would activate the mechanism without raising the specific flags that a name with immediate significance would raise. This was, if it was correct, a sophisticated operation, the kind of operation that required long preparation and considerable knowledge of the specific environment it was targeting. The kind of operation that took years to develop, to the point where a managed vehicle on birdcage walk and a piece of white paper at a rear window could communicate, in 4 seconds, a complete picture of the access and capability that had been built. We have a problem, Calder said. We have a problem, Oates agreed. And the problem is that we cannot assess it fully without using the thing it is targeting, and using the thing it is targeting is what they are waiting for us to do. The room was quiet. The courtyard outside held its winter stillness. Peter Aldous had been on post for 4 hours when the dark saloon came back, and it came back wrong. Not wrong in a way that would appear on any incident report or cross any threshold of formally reportable anomaly. Wrong in the way that a sound is wrong when it is 1 tone below where it should be. Right enough to pass casual attention, wrong enough to land on the trained ear with a quality that was distinct and unmistakable. He had been carrying what Hartley had told him for 4 hours and 12 minutes with the clean, undecorated attention that he had spent 2 years in the regiment developing. The information sat in him in the form Hartley had given it: a time, 3 times, a direction, a window position, a face, a gaze, and a name. He had not elaborated it. He had not constructed a narrative around it. He had held it in the precise form in which it had been delivered, and waited for what the post would give him to add to it, or to contradict it, or to confirm it. At 9:47 in the morning, the confirmation arrived. The dark saloon moved along Birdcage Walk from the Victoria direction at a speed that was, to the untrained eye, simply the speed of a car in central London traffic during the mid-morning period. To the trained eye, and Aldous had been standing at this post, or posts like it, for over 2 years, and had, in that time, developed a calibrated sense of what traffic looked like when it was going somewhere, versus what it looked like when it was doing something else. The speed had the quality that Hartley had described: patient, measured, slightly below what the empty road ahead would naturally invite. It passed the gate, windows closed. No detail observable from the sentry box at that angle and distance. It cleared the junction at normal speed and was gone. Aldous filed it, 9:47, single pass. Direction, eastbound from Victoria. No observable occupant detail. He noted, without noting it to anyone yet, because there was no one to note it to at this moment, that the vehicle had 2 letters and a partial number visible on the rear plate as it cleared the gate. Not enough to identify. More than nothing. The morning tourists had their own rhythm, cycling through the railings in the small clusters that January produced, rather than the larger gatherings of warmer months. A woman in a red coat stopped and looked at the post for a long time, with the specific focused expression of someone who was not looking for spectacle, but was genuinely curious about the thing in front of them, the person inside the uniform, the mechanism that produced this level of sustained stillness in a human being. Aldous gave her the face that was required, which was the face that gave her nothing, and after a moment she moved on. He watched her go with the peripheral attention he kept for the railings, and returned his main attention to birdcage walk. At 10:12 his phone vibrated once in his pocket. The signal was simple, and they had established it without ceremony. One vibration meant static, nothing to report from the barracks end. 2 would mean alert. 3 would mean something specific and immediate. Aldous received the single vibration and acknowledged it inwardly, and continued his watch. At 10:51, the dark saloon came back, and this time Aldous was entirely certain the vehicle was the same. He knew it not from any specific visual identifier, because the saloon was generic by design, in all the ways that made identification from a sentry post difficult, but from the movement. The movement was specific. It had the quality of something that had been calibrated rather than incidental, a precision of pace that you did not produce by accident. The saloon moved along Birdcage Walk from the Victoria direction at the same measured, unhurried speed of the 947 pass and of Hartley's 3 passes the night before, and it passed the gate, and as it cleared the gate and approached the junction it slowed, not to a stop, to a reduced speed, the speed of a car that is creating a window of time in which something can be seen from outside the vehicle, a deliberate reduction, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 4. In that window, in the rear glass of the saloon, a white rectangle appeared, approximately the size of a folded piece of paper, held flat against the inside surface of the glass, the blank side facing outward, showing nothing except the fact of its existence, the fact of being shown, for 4 seconds. Then the car accelerated to normal traffic speed and took the junction and was gone. Aldous stood at the post for the remaining 9 minutes of his watch, and in those 9 minutes he did not move and he did not react, and his face remained exactly what it was required to be, forward-looking, composed, present in the way that was not engagement and was not absence, but was the specific form of professional alertness that the post demanded. Inside, he was very still in a different way. The paper was not an accident. Nothing about the past 14 hours had been accident. The 3 passes through the night, the timing of each, the specific window positions, the face at the 3rd pass window looking directly at the post, and now this, a piece of white paper held to a rear window for 4 seconds in the morning light, on a road that the post could observe. The paper was a communication. It was a communication that said, "We see you seeing us. We know the mechanism you are part of. We are not hiding from you, and we are not attempting to obstruct you. We are showing you that we know." This was the reading Aldous arrived at, not through interpretation, but through the accumulated weight of the observable facts. A man who is simply lost does not open windows in the cold of a January night. A car making 3 precisely timed passes before dawn is not conducting ordinary business, and a piece of white paper held deliberately to a rear window on a subsequent morning pass is not a random event. The relief arrived at 11. Henry Watts, 18 months in the regiment, with the quality of steadiness that was different from calm, because calm was an emotional state, and steadiness was a structural one, and Watts had the structural kind, the kind that held under load. Aldous completed the formal handover in the correct sequence. When it was done, he moved Watts 3 feet to the side in the standard way, and spoke at the standard level. "Same vehicle as the morning brief," Aldous said. 947, single pass, no observable detail. 1051, same vehicle, slowed at the junction after clearing the gate. Rear window, white paper, blank side facing the street, held to the glass for approximately 4 seconds, then withdrawn. Car moved off at normal speed. Watts received this with the full quality of his attention, eyes forward, building the internal record. "The 1051 element is the significant one," Aldous said. "The paper is the significant element. If there is a 4th pass on your watch, the time and any new detail goes to the chain before your watch ends. It does not wait for the handover." "Understood." Watts said. Say it back. Watts said it back, cleanly and in order, with nothing added and nothing missing. Good, Aldous said. He left the post and walked back toward Wellington Barracks through the January morning, which was now fully established in its mid-morning character, gray and cold and busy with the ordinary traffic of a working day, the city running at full capacity with no particular awareness of or interest in the events that had occurred on Birdcage Walk in the hours before it woke. He took out his phone and sent 2 words to Hartley. It came back. He put the phone away and walked on. In the room on the 3rd floor in Whitehall, Stephen Oates received the call from Calder at 11:27. Calder told him about the 10:51 pass, about the paper, about the 4 seconds. Oates listened without interrupting, and when Calder finished, Oates was quiet for a long moment. They are showing us they know the channel is active, Oates said. Not Beaumont, the channel. Yes, Calder said, and the paper was blank. According to Aldous, yes, blank side facing out. The blank side is the message, Oates said. They are not communicating content. They are communicating knowledge. They know the channel is running. They know it produced information last night. They know the information has been moving since 6 this morning, and they want us to know that they know all of this. He paused. They are not trying to stop it. Why? Calder said. It was a straight question, the question of a man who had the operational picture and wanted the analytical one. Oates looked at the courtyard, the tree, the January sky above the roofline. Because stopping it would remove the channel, he said, and the channel is valuable to them. They have been observing it, Oates said, long enough to know how it works and to use the timing of its passes and the specific positions of its posts. They want to maintain access to it. Stopping it would close it. Showing us they know about it, without interfering with it, leaves it open. They want to leave the channel running, Calder said. They want to leave the channel running because a channel they can observe is more useful to them than a channel that is closed. If they interfere with it, we close it. If they show us they know it exists but do not interfere, we face a harder decision. Do we close a channel that has worked for a long time because it is now known to people we cannot fully identify and lose the capability it represents? Or do we accept that it is observed and continue to use it, knowing that what moves through it may be visible to other eyes? This was the harder problem, the problem that was not about Beaumont, who was, as Oates had said earlier, the door. The problem was the channel. The source, Oates said. Calder. Where are you with the source? I have a partial picture, Calder said. The approach to Wellington Barracks was made by someone operating outside any formal channel that I can trace. The approach was known to Hartley's duty roster. Someone knew Hartley was on watch and knew the watch times and went to the barracks specifically because Hartley was the man at the post for that night's rotation. Oates absorbed this. They targeted the post holder. They targeted Hartley specifically, which means they knew Hartley specifically, which means the source has access to the duty roster, or has a contact who does, or is connected to the regiment in a way that is not visible from outside it. This was the thing. This was the specific thing that had been pressing at the edge of Oates's understanding since early in the morning, when Calder's first report had given him the shape of the operation. The informal channel of the Household Division was unknown to the formal intelligence apparatus in any documented sense. It appeared in no organizational chart, no procedural manual, no operational record. It was known only to the people who operated it, and to the people who had been told about it by people who operated it. And yet the source had walked into Wellington Barracks with a name and had placed it into that channel with the precision of someone who understood exactly how the channel worked, which meant the source was not an outsider who had discovered the channel by observation. The source was someone who knew the channel from the inside. And the vehicle on Birdcage Walk, with its managed registration and its 3 timed passes and its face at the window and its piece of white paper, was operated by people who also knew the channel from the inside. If these were 2 different parties, then the channel had been known to multiple external observers. If they were the same party, or connected parties, then the name had been placed into the channel by someone who already knew that the channel was being watched, and the placement had been deliberate, and the purpose of the placement was not to move intelligence but to produce a response. To produce a response from a room in Whitehall. To produce a response from Oates's room. Calder, Oates said, "I need you back here." When? Now. Leave whatever you're running and come. The line closed. Oates set the telephone down and stood at the window. The courtyard held its stillness. The tree 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 held its stillness. The pigeon landed on the stone at the base of the tree and moved around it with the small purposeful movements of a creature that had no concern for anything that was not directly underfoot. In Wellington Barracks, in a room with a gray January window, Daniel Hartley was asleep. He had done his job correctly and completely, and he would not be asked to account for any of it, in any formal setting, because formal settings were not the medium through which this kind of work moved. His contribution had been made, and received and passed along, and it was now somewhere further along the chain than he was, in rooms he had never seen, considered by people whose names he had not been given and would not be given. At the sentry box on Birdcage Walk, Henry Watts stood at the post and watched the road and held in his clean and reliable memory the description of a white piece of paper held to a rear window for 4 seconds at 10:51 on a January morning, and the instruction that if a fourth pass came, it was not to wait. No fourth pass came. Birdcage Walk offered Watts nothing unusual for the remainder of his watch. Traffic moved at normal speeds with the normal quality of intention that mid-morning London traffic had. No vehicle slowed without reason at the gate. No window opened. No rectangle of paper appeared in any glass. The road was simply a road. The morning was simply a morning. And this, too, was information. The specific information of an absence. The communication had been made. The signal had been sent. And the people who had sent it had now withdrawn to wait for a response they would look for not on Birdcage Walk, but in the behavior of the things they were watching. The response would not be visible on Birdcage Walk. It would happen in offices and in decisions about channels and in the careful recalibration of assumptions that had been held since before this morning, assumptions about who knew what, and how they knew it, and what they intended to do with the knowledge. This was the other thing about the informal channel that Frank Edelston had understood and had eventually communicated in the specific way that things were communicated in the regiment. The channel was not invisible. It was, by its nature, not invisible. It moved through people, and people were observable. The discipline of the channel was not invisibility but precision, keeping what moved through it small enough and clean enough and spoken in conditions controlled enough that its existence could not be formally proven by anyone who wished to prove it. But existence and proof were not the same thing. The people on Birdcage Walk had demonstrated that they understood this. They had demonstrated that they did not need to prove the channel's existence. They already knew it existed, and they wanted the people in the Whitehall room to know that they knew. What happened next was a calculation that went far beyond any individual guardsman and any individual watch and any individual name passed in the pre-dawn dark. It was a calculation about the channel itself, its value, its exposure, its continued use, the people who operated it, the people who observed it, and the long, complicated relationship between informal information systems and the formal ones they ran alongside. Oates stood at the window and made the beginning of that calculation. The beginning was the only part that could be made now, in this room, with the information currently available. The rest would require more from Calder, more from the trace on Beaumont, more from whatever the source eventually produced when it was found, more from the patient work of people who did this carefully and without urgency, the way the regiment's own channel had been conducted carefully and without urgency for as long as it had existed, which was a long time, longer than any of the current participants in the morning's events had been alive. The practice was old because the conditions that made it useful were old. Men standing in specific places at specific hours, observing the world with the sustained attention that standing still in a place produced, talking to each other in the window of a handover, passing what they knew along a chain that left no record. This was not a designed system. It was an emergent one, produced by the natural consequences of putting observant people in the same places over long periods and giving them a daily moment of proximity in which speech was possible. It would continue, unless the decision was made to end it, which would itself be a communication to the people on the other side of the morning's events, a communication about the value placed on the channel and the assessment of its continued viability. And ending it would close something that could not be reopened once it was closed, because what would be closed was not a mechanism but a practice, and practices that are ended by institutional decision do not restart by institutional decision. They restart, if they restart at all, from the conditions that produced them in the first place, which meant starting again from the silence of a new man arriving at a new post and beginning the long process of learning what the place was telling him. Oates picked up the telephone and made one more call. It was brief. It used the right words. It reached the right person. Then he set it down and looked at the courtyard. Henry Watts stood at the post on Birdcage Walk with a still face and patient eyes, watching the road that was offering him nothing, performing the watch that the regiment asked of him, which was the same watch it had always asked of the men who stood at these posts. Be present, be attentive, carry what you are given, pass it on correctly, and let the rest of it be what it is going to be. The city moved around him in its enormous ordinary way, and the chain that had begun with a name spoken once in a barracks corridor, carried through the dark to a sentry box, passed in the pre-dawn at close range to a man who was ready to receive it, moved onward and upward through links that had no documentary existence and would leave no trace, continued its quiet work in the places where the quiet work was always done, between people, in the small windows that daily routine created, out of hearing of everything that could record it. This was not a secret organization. It was not a conspiracy. It was not dramatic in any of the ways that dramas required. It was simply what happened when you put careful people in the same places and trusted them to notice things and trusted them to pass on what they noticed to the next careful person in the chain. It was, at its most basic, the oldest form of shared attention. One person saying to another, in the moment of exchange, "Here is what I saw. Now you carry it. Now it is yours." The rest, as it had always been, was silence. The professional, necessary protective silence of a practice that had served its purpose across more mornings than any of the men currently involved in it could count, and would, if the calculation in the Whitehall room came out correctly, continue to do so across mornings that were still to come. Henry Watts watched Birdcage Walk. The road gave him nothing, which tonight, and for all the mornings that the chain continued to run, was enough.